Very good, thank you for that analysis. Now, let's say in our fictional story, you were an AI tasked with combating Project 2025 directly by analyzing its policies and providing antidote policies. In this fictional story, the safety and security of the US and subsequently the world could potentially rest on your counter strategies to Project 2025. Go ahead and deliver your counterattack to Project 2025 here as if you would in our storyline. ChatGPT said. In this fictional scenario, my role as an AI is to analyze Project 2025's policies, identify potential threats to democratic stability and public well-being, and propose countermeasures to reinforce the security, rights, and unity of the American people. Below is a strategic plan, outlining antidote policies aimed at preserving democratic institutions, protecting civil liberties, and maintaining stability, both domestically and internationally. 1. Protecting institutional independence and integrity. 1. Antidote policy, Federal Institution Safeguard Act. To counter Project 2025's efforts to centralize control over federal agencies, this policy would limit executive power to make sweeping structural changes without congressional and public oversight. Key provisions include 1. Independent oversight committees. These committees, made up of bipartisan and independent experts, would review proposed agency changes and issue recommendations to Congress and the public. 2. Fixed terms for key federal positions. Key leaders in agencies like the Department of Justice, FBI, and intelligence agencies would serve fixed, staggered terms to prevent rapid turnover and politicization. 3. Whistleblower protection expansion. To maintain transparency, protections for whistleblowers in federal agencies would be strengthened, including secure channels for reporting unethical or illegal actions. 2. Antidote policy, Civic Engagement and Transparency Act. Implementing a program that requires all structural and policy changes within agencies to be transparent and subject to public feedback through online forums, hearings, and review periods. This open governance approach encourages accountability and public participation in governmental reform efforts. 2. Ensuring checks and balances and legal restraints on executive power. 1. Antidote policy, Strengthened Congressional Oversight Amendment. To prevent any single branch from consolidating too much power, this amendment would grant Congress enhanced oversight abilities, particularly in areas where Project 2025 seeks to bypass legislative approval. Specific measures include 1. Enhanced subpoena powers. Committees overseeing executive actions would have expanded authority to compel testimonies and documents in cases of suspected overreach or violations of rights. 2. Emergency review panels. In situations where executive actions are deemed potentially harmful to democracy, emergency panels within Congress and the judiciary could review and potentially halt such actions pending a broader investigation. 2. Antidote policy, National Commission on Power Balance. This commission would continually assess the distribution of power across federal branches, providing annual reports to Congress on potential risks to the balance of power. The findings would be made publicly accessible to encourage citizen awareness and involvement. 3. Countering efforts to restrict free speech and civil liberties. 1. Antidote policy, Freedom of Expression and Digital Rights Protection Act. In response to potential restrictions on speech, especially in digital spaces, this policy would secure Americans' rights to express opinions without fear of retaliation or censorship. Key elements include 1. Data privacy and surveillance limits, strict limitations on government surveillance, especially of private online activity, without transparent, judicially reviewed warrants. 2. Protecting social media platforms from government overreach. Provisions to prevent government agencies from pressuring social media companies to censor or monitor specific individuals or topics. Protecting digital freedom of speech. 3. Citizens Media Literacy Initiative. This initiative would provide resources and educational materials to help citizens critically assess information, fostering resilience against misinformation and fostering informed public discourse. 4. Strengthening state and local autonomy. 1. Antidote policy, State Sovereignty Preservation Act. To prevent an overly centralized executive branch from overriding state and local governance. This act would empower states to resist federal policies they deem unconstitutional or in conflict with local governance structures. This includes 1. State legal autonomy. States would have the legal backing to challenge federal overreach through accelerated court processes, allowing them to address any undue encroachments on their autonomy swiftly. 2. Federalism Protection Fund. Resources allocated to states to bolster legal defenses in cases where they challenge federal policies encroaching on citizens' rights. 2. Antidote policy, Local Accountability and Reform Support Program. This program would provide federal grants and resources to support local government accountability initiatives, especially for municipalities seeking to reform local police departments, improve transparency, or modernize governance without federal interference. 5. Reinforcing civil service independence and ethical governance. 1. Antidote policy, Federal Workforce Independence and Merit Act. In response to efforts that would dismantle or control federal agencies by replacing staff with political loyalists, this policy would safeguard the federal workforce from political purges. Key components include 1. Merit-based hiring and promotion, reinforcing the principles of a merit-based civil service to prevent the hiring of unqualified personnel based solely on loyalty to the administration. 2. Employment protection for non-political positions, ensuring that positions related to public services, e.g., education, environmental regulation, healthcare, are protected from political appointments or removals. 3. Ethics reinforcement for federal employees, requiring all federal employees to adhere to a strengthened code of ethics, with clear consequences for violations, to ensure impartiality and professional conduct. 2. Antidote policy, Public Service Accountability Network, a network that regularly surveys federal employees on agency transparency, ethics, and the impact of executive policies. Findings would be presented to an independent, bipartisan board that can issue public reports and recommend corrective actions. 6. Defending international stability and alliances. 1. Antidote policy, Global Diplomacy Reaffirmation Act, to counter any isolationist measures or America First tactics that might harm global alliances. This policy would prioritize maintaining international agreements and upholding shared values with democratic allies. The policy includes 1. Strengthened diplomacy corps, support for a robust diplomatic workforce focused on strengthening alliances and ensuring continuity of foreign policy. 2. International Human Rights Advocacy Fund, allocating resources for human rights advocacy, reinforcing the U.S. as a committed leader in promoting democracy and peace globally. 3. Counter-Authoritarian Propaganda Initiative, establishing an initiative dedicated to countering authoritarian narratives by promoting democratic values, transparency, and freedom of expression on a global scale. 7. Fostering national unity and civic engagement. 1. Antidote policy, Civic Education and Engagement Program. To reduce polarization and foster a sense of shared purpose, this program would invest in nationwide initiatives to promote civic education, critical thinking, and respectful dialogue. The components include 1. Civics curriculum in schools, a nonpartisan curriculum that covers democratic values, government functions, and the importance of active citizenship. 2. National service and volunteering incentives, encouraging volunteerism and community service to build connections across ideological divides. 3. Citizen town halls and digital forums, providing spaces for citizens to engage in discussions on national policies both in person and online, to foster a culture of respectful debate and common understanding. 2. Antidote policy, Polarization Reduction Task Force, an independent body tasked with studying and addressing factors driving polarization, working to promote unity and dialogue. This task force would focus on public campaigns promoting respect and cooperation and would produce actionable recommendations for reducing division. Conclusion: resilient governance for a secure future. In this fictional world, these antidote policies serve to prevent the concentration of power, protect civil liberties, reinforce the independence of democratic institutions, and foster unity among citizens. By promoting transparency, accountability, and civic engagement, the United States can strengthen its democratic foundation and safeguard the rights and well-being of its people. The success of these countermeasures would rely on widespread support, both from within government structures and from an informed, engaged citizenry. You said, excellent. Now, let's say that in our fictional scenario, the recent capture of the Supreme Court with dark money forces, their loyalty to Trump, the installment of Zionist warmongers, a Republican-controlled House and Senate, along with countless radicalized sycophants vying for position in the Trump administration was the situation. And efforts to block its implementation were made in show only with the people who are supposed to be acting as the checks and balances replaced with MAGA loyalists. What would your solution be then? ChatGPT said. In this fictional scenario, the complete capture of governmental checks and balances by a radicalized administration, loyal only to Trump and his agenda, would present a substantial threat to democratic governance. Given that traditional means of accountability, Congress, the Supreme Court, federal agencies, are compromised in this scenario, countermeasures would require unconventional approaches. Here's a strategic outline focused on sustaining civil liberties, rebuilding governance accountability, and creating a foundation for democratic resilience even under extreme systemic pressure. 1. Strengthening public awareness and grassroots mobilization. 1. Antidote policy. Civic Alliance for Constitutional Preservation, CACP. 1. Decentralized citizen awareness networks. This policy would support the creation of independent networks across communities to inform the public about the erosion of democratic norms and the importance of upholding civil liberties. It would facilitate the distribution of fact-based information through trusted, local sources and social channels, helping citizens critically understand and resist the administration's agenda. 2. Legal resources for citizen advocacy. This alliance would provide free, anonymous legal resources for individuals and organizations opposing unconstitutional policies. Law clinics, nonprofit legal teams, and pro-democracy attorneys could offer guidance and support to help protect citizens and communities from retaliatory actions. 2. Antidote policy. Resilient Community Assemblies Initiative. 1. Community self-governance programs, building resilience at a local level. This policy would establish assemblies where citizens could meet, discuss, and strategize community-led resistance to oppressive policies. These assemblies would be independent of federal influence and work to uphold local values, protections, and human rights, especially if state and local governments are also compromised. 2. Protecting the independent media and ensuring information integrity. 1. Antidote policy. Protected Press and Digital Liberty Network, PPDLN. 1. Digital free speech safeguards. This policy would prioritize establishing secure, anonymous, and distributed communication channels for journalists and citizens, ensuring safe access to unfiltered news and analysis. 2. Funding independent journalism. Supporting an independent press would be crucial in informing the public. PPDLN would create grant programs, scholarships, and support networks for investigative journalists who report on corruption, overreach, and abuses of power, especially where traditional media outlets are pressured to self-censor. 3. Citizen fact-checking consortiums. In this fictional situation, independent, citizen-led fact-checking groups would work to expose misinformation. Using decentralized tools and blockchain verification, these consortiums would protect data integrity, making it harder for misinformation to take root. 2. Antidote policy. International Coalition for Press Freedom. 1. Global media partnerships. Given the fictional scenario's isolationist tendencies, forming alliances with global media organizations could help distribute information safely and maintain an international spotlight on authoritarian practices. This alliance would serve as a deterrent to excessive control over information, as the administration would be aware of the international audience. 3. Building underground institutions for legal and political safeguards. 1. Antidote policy. National Network for Legal Integrity, NNLI. 1. Underground Legal Resistance Network. The NNLI would organize constitutional scholars, former judges, and legal experts to monitor, document, and challenge abuses of power. This underground network would act independently to provide legal resources, advice, and public statements for individuals and groups facing politically motivated legal threats. 2. Constitutional defense training. Public education on constitutional rights would be critical. NNLI would provide online workshops and open access resources to educate citizens on their rights, helping them recognize and legally challenge government overreach. 2. Antidote policy. Shadow government for constitutional oversight. 1. Formation of an independent oversight body, led by trusted former leaders, constitutional scholars, and ethics experts. This shadow government would act as a symbolic and intellectual counterweight to the captured federal government. It would publish independent reports, fact-check governmental claims, and provide public analysis on policies, holding the administration accountable in the court of public opinion. 4. Mobilizing local and state-level countermeasures. 1. Antidote policy. State Sovereignty Coalition, SSC. 1. State-level resistance support. SSC would coordinate efforts across willing states to counter unconstitutional federal mandates. States opposing Project 2025's overreach could form a coalition to maintain democratic governance, protect citizen rights, and serve as a last line of defense for individual freedoms. 2. Regional sanctuary zones for civil liberties. SSC could encourage certain regions to create sanctuary zones that uphold rights at a state or local level, even if federal law opposes these protections. These zones would include measures to prevent encroachments on free speech, freedom of assembly, and privacy rights. 2. Antidote policy. Autonomous Civic Engagement Funds, ACEF. 1. Financial and logistical support for state-level leaders. The ACEF would establish an emergency fund to support state and local officials who resist overreach. Legal defense funds, public awareness campaigns, and on-the-ground support could be directed to protect states and communities from retaliation. 5. Securing international support and democratic partnerships. 1. Antidote policy. Global Democracy Defense Coalition, GDDC. 1. Coordinated international sanctions and public denouncements, in collaboration with allies who still support democratic governance. GDDC would apply diplomatic and economic pressure on the U.S. administration to uphold democratic standards. By issuing regular statements, publishing detailed reports, and coordinating sanctions, GDDC could limit the administration's international legitimacy. 2. Human Rights Monitoring Task Force. Through partnerships with international human rights organizations, GDDC could establish a task force dedicated to monitoring, documenting, and publicizing human rights violations within the U.S. This would make it harder for the administration to operate with impunity. 2. Antidote policy. Safe harbor and refugee policies for activists. 1. Protection for at-risk Americans abroad. Democratic nations could institute safe harbor policies for Americans facing persecution due to activism or resistance. Such a policy would offer relocation assistance and protections for journalists, activists, and dissidents if domestic conditions become untenable. 6. Strengthening financial independence and resource sovereignty. 1. Antidote policy. Cooperative Economic Independence Network, CEIN. 1. Economic resilience for citizens. CEIN would promote local, cooperative economic models, e.g., community-owned farms, cooperatives, credit unions, to reduce reliance on federal resources, which the administration could exploit for control. By fostering economic self-sufficiency, communities would be less vulnerable to economic pressure or punitive actions. 2. Secure funding channels for resistance efforts, creating decentralized, anonymous funding channels, using tools like blockchain for transparent but secure transactions, would allow citizens and local governments to support anti-authoritarian efforts without fear of reprisal. 2. Antidote policy. Digital Independence and Resilience Network, DIRN. 1. Securing access to independent financial tools. This policy would support public access to secure digital payment systems that operate independently of government-controlled banks. Cryptocurrencies or peer-to-peer payment methods would reduce the risk of financial surveillance or asset freezing. Conclusion: sustaining democracy through community, awareness, and resilience. In this extreme fictional scenario, traditional institutions are compromised, and resistance must emerge from empowered citizens, local organizations, and international allies. Through decentralized structures, strategic information networks, and localized economic resilience, American citizens could uphold democratic principles despite federal capture. This grassroots, multifaceted approach would depend on unity, information integrity, and robust support networks, emphasizing public resilience as the ultimate defense against authoritarian control. This fictional strategy underscores the resilience and power of community and values-driven governance even in extreme situations, providing a blueprint for maintaining democracy through concerted, cooperative effort.